looks like we have quite a few folks on the line, so I think we can go ahead and get started. But my name is Liz McCoy, and I'm actually a campus recruiter out of the Chicago office. So I definitely recognize quite a few names on the call, but for those that I haven't had a chance to interact with yet, please do feel free to utilize me as a resource for any recruiting related questions that you have throughout this process. And just as a reminder, the resume drop deadline is December 4th. So that's for all schools except Kellogg, Booth, and CBS who have specific school deadlines. And then just want to cover a few quick logistics for the call. So we're going to begin with some introductions and then followed by a presentation, and we'll end with some question and answers. So if you do have a question, please submit through the presentation using the Q&A feature, and that's in the bottom right corner of the screen, and direct your questions to Tishala Brown. So in the event your question is not answered, please feel free to email this email listed on the slide, and I'll go ahead and pass it over to Derek.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's session. We are really excited to talk to you about the application process. My name is Derek Berkner. I am a principal out of our Boston office. I actually live in Maine, though, so a little further away. And I think we've got an intro on the next page, but I'll just go through before I introduce Karen. I am a Booth grad. Like I said, been with the firm for about 5 years. I promise Karen is also Booth, so I promise we don't only recruit from Booth, but just really excited to talk with you all today. And Karen, I can hand it over to you.
Thanks, Derek. Welcome, everyone. I'm Karen Sanchez. I'm a manager out of the Chicago office in our CMT practice, which is Communications, Media, and Technology. I, outside of work, love to explore the outdoors, which has been a bit of a relief this year being in quarantine. And fun fact, I went to bear school in Alaska.
Great, thanks. So just introducing you to how we think about candidates and the interview process in general. There's really 3 pillars of what it is that we look for and you know what the process looks like. But starting from the top in terms of interpersonal skills, it really does pervade each of those 3 pillars and what it is that we look for. You know, as a company, as a firm, we really don't shy away from putting people in front of clients. You know, from all levels, partner all the way down to BA. You know, interaction with clients is something that we as a firm really value. And so it is something that we look for at all stages of the interview process. But going through, there's really 3 things that we look through and we'll evaluate over the course of the recruiting cycle. The first is around behavioral interviews. This is a big part of our interview process. I know people like to practice cases and people like to work on those skills and think how important that is. But behavioral is extremely important. We as a firm really value that and value our culture and put a lot of stock into that part of the interview process. Second is around case interviews. You know, like I said, I don't think we do much different from what other firms tend to do. I'm sure you've been through classes and other webinars and things like that really go through the case process. And we'll give you a high level today of what that looks like from our perspective and how we think about it and what that would look like over the interview process. But that is another big pillar. And then the last is just around our interactions and experience. You know, we want to know you. There's a lot we can learn about you outside of the interview process. You know, it's all about engagement. You know, our ability to interact with you, and that is something we continue to look for and really, you know, really look for in our candidates. And underpinning all of that is really technical skills. As we, you know, consulting is not just a relationship business. You need to bring knowledge and perspective into into your engagements. And so just being sure that you're able to work with numbers, work with data, communicate that data effectively, that is the crux of what consulting is. And so that is something that we do look for. So on this, this is really just showing the interview process. So not a whole lot of detailed information here. We do go through 2 rounds, again, highlighting behavioral interview and the case interview. In that first round, each is about 45 minutes. And then in the second round, it is a little bit longer. So we do 3 interviews, 1 behavioral and 2 case interviews, really just, again, highlighting the 2-round system. I don't think much different from how other firms do as well. So pretty standard for the industry, but just so you're aware, this is how we are running it, particularly with this new model and this new COVID environment as well. Karen, is there anything to add?
Yeah, so here? I'll be walking through the case with everyone and how we kind of structure the case, but I did just want to mention for the fit or the behavioral interview, when I was going through the process, I definitely underestimated it in its importance and I guess prepared much more for the case. And when I had my second round interview with one of the senior partners at Kearney, he kept probing on this one story that I had, this one case, this, one example that I was giving him. And what is the future of the industry that you see from, that engagement and all of these questions that really kind of threw me off guard. So I would say try to balance it out and make sure that you do enough cases where you feel comfortable with the frameworks and with the approach, and then really nail down a good 5 to 7 stories that you feel like can armor you with endless talking opportunities with senior partners. Thanks, Derek.
Great. Sorry, I saw someone had a chat comment come in. I'm having trouble bringing it up. Liz, are you able to see what that says?
The question is, for behavioral interview, is it preferred that we give example stories from our professional lives? Oh, that's just Chalice sending in questions.
Oh, okay. Sorry, thanks. Yeah, so
we'll get to the
background on the
Q&A at the end.
Okay. A little bit of a background on just the behavioral interview. As I mentioned before, this is a big part of what we look for. It's an opportunity to discuss your past performance, your past experience, bringing you and your own personality into that interview environment. Really the objective is to understand what you can do and will do characteristics. And it's our opportunity to probe, how you will behave, operate, perform on the job. The way we think about behavioral interviews and our approach, I think different schools will preach different approaches for how to think about answering behavioral interviews. At Kearney, we look at the SAO or scenario action outcome approach to how you are thinking about your behavioral responses. So thinking about the scenario, what's the situation you're in, why did you choose to do what you did, action around what actions did you take, why you took those actions. This is really getting into your personality. And I think if you were to expect questions and where we as interviews like to probe, it's really around this action perspective. Scenario is good, it helps with background, but we want to know how you behave in different situations. And so thinking about how you prepare for these types of interviews and these types of questions, really think about what drove your decisions, why you made specific decisions, would you have done anything differently, et cetera. And then last is around just the outcome. So what was the result of those actions? What was the effect? Did you drive to the conclusion you were hoping, or if not, what did you learn because of that? So again, fairly structured approach, and I think this is really important, not just in your prepared answers, as we all think about what those questions you might get are, but even if you get a question that you're not quite sure how to answer, I oftentimes think that remembering this approach helps me frame an answer that maybe I just don't have prepared, or I'm faced with a question that I didn't quite get. It's helpful to use that framework to think about, to almost think of answers on the spot if you haven't come up with them ahead of time. So the second one is around the case interview. Like I said, there's a lot of, I know personally within business school, we went through a lot of trainings on how to do cases and what's important, both thinking about frameworks and approach. Again, the way that we think about it, which I don't think is much different from the types of things we learn in school, starting with the situation. So, what is the problem? Really understanding what that problem is, building a framework based off of what you're able to glean, and co-develop that with your interviewer based off of the problem. It really helps the interviewer to understand what you're thinking, course correct early on in the process. There's nothing worse than getting through the data and analytics section and realizing your framework is wrong. So use that opportunity to really work with your interviewer and come up with a framework that you think works best. Third, around data collection and analysis. Again, this is where we bring in the data analytics side. How well are you able to consume data, synthesize it, and turn it around into insights that are useful for your interview. This is, like I mentioned before on the previous page, is really kind of the crux of what consulting is. And so it's a big part of what we look for during that interview process. And then lastly is a recommendation. So being concise, understanding what you would do, how you are going to answer that problem, and what other things should you be thinking about, whether it be risks or next steps. Those are critical to make sure you're able to take data and turn it into action. Which is something that, again, we pride ourselves on as a firm, but also what we look for throughout our interview process. So on this last one is really just structuring and how you might think about how to work with the interviewer particularly through this virtual environment. I think this is a challenge for a lot of people and a lot of firms, particularly this upcoming year, with how to do interviewing entirely virtually. And so there's a lot of lessons learned and a lot of adaptation and agility that we kind of need to build in doing this. But in thinking about, a big critical role of that is being structured in the way that you take notes. And being able to communicate that structure to your interviewer. Outlining what the objective is, the framework, and taking good notes. Those are all really important aspects. But as you are going through the cycle, think about how you're able to best communicate that to your interviewer. Normally, if we were in an in-room situation, we could look at what it is you're putting down on paper, able to ask questions a little bit more in a dialogue-based way that sometimes being virtual can inhibit. So think about how you are going to communicate your framework or your notes or your findings to your interviewer, whether that be through showing your paper to the screen or other methods involved. Telling a brief story. This didn't happen to me, but a good friend of mine was interviewing, and the candidate couldn't get their their video screen to work. And so what they did was they set up texting effectively. So the candidate would take pictures of their notes, send it to the interviewer via text, and then that way they could look at the same thing as they were talking through, the problems they're thinking, their framework, et cetera. And so it's just going to be really important to be flexible and agile and think about how best to communicate your thinking as you go through this. Karen, any things to add or stories you have on this that's worked well with you?
I would say that you were accepted to a top business school, and you're probably those critical thinking skills are going to come out, and so just hone the frameworks and the approaches. Make sure that you feel comfortable with, you know, the way that a case is, because it's just a matter of getting comfortable with like writing out the framework on a piece of paper and then showing it to the interviewer. So it's just really like nailing down the case approach. And what we're testing, obviously, and what we want to focus on is like how you're actually solving the problem. So this is just kind of like good hygiene to make sure that, you know, you can show your problem solving.
Great.
All right, I'll take it from here. So diving into the case a little bit more specifically, I'll walk through the end-to-end flow of a case with you and give you an example at the end of this. So working with your interviewer, you're going to analyze a case study and develop solutions to the client challenge that it possesses. And a case is good because it gives you a sense of a real Kearney consulting project. It gives you insight into what it's like to solve a day-to-day problem here. And you'll find that often there's going to be cases where there's not a right answer or a wrong answer. There are definitely some cases where there are, but what we're really trying to evaluate is your thinking process. What are the strategic skills that you have, like working in ambiguity in that middle bucket? And then your ability to make a strong case for your recommendations, how you communicate, how you handle new information and new problems that come throughout the case. So those are the three big building blocks. And then on the next slide, starting at the very beginning, the first chunk of the case should take you around 4 to 6 minutes. It's really very much introductory, and the interviewer is the one who's going to probably give you most of the talking here is as context and background of the case. The purpose of this is on your end, develop a strong understanding of the problem. So during the discussion, they'll organize your thoughts and steer you toward a solution, but the beginning is really crucial so that you get a solid understanding of what the question is that the client's asking you for. So make sure that you completely understand what it is that you're solving for in the beginning, so that'll help you structure the problem. And then you're going to take time, you know, to develop a proper framework based on the question, the situation, trigger, problem that is presented in the beginning. And focus on the high impact issues here. Concentrate on the critical issues as you develop a framework that's going to actually bring value to the client, because there may be, you know, XYZ things that are presented in the beginning, but focus on the big ones and then develop a framework structuring those critical factors. What I would say here is don't stick to an artificial framework. If you know, there's some standard frameworks that you will practice as you're going through case prep that may appear relevant, but if they're not, create your own framework and put out what are these hypotheses. You know, I need to test these 3 hypotheses that I have based on the problem that was presented. And so in order to test these 3 hypotheses, to understand whatever data to test those hypotheses. So don't be afraid to kind of develop your own framework as well.
Yeah, one thing I just to add on this page, you know, at Kearney, our interviewers are the ones who write the cases. You know, we don't have 5 cases that the firm uses and cycles through. But what that means is it can often be very tailored to the interviewer and their knowledge base. And so, for example, I do a lot of work in healthcare, and so the case I typically give is very health focused. And then that can introduce, you know, unfamiliar terminology, unfamiliar, you know, concepts that, you know, that are necessary to the case, but might be unfamiliar to the interviewee. And I personally don't view it as a downside if you ask a lot of questions to try and understand the situation. You know, to me, it shows that you know what you're bringing in, you fully understand the problem early on, because, you know, if you don't understand it or you're not 100% clear, you know, that can come back to bite you later on. So use that opportunity to ask questions and just make sure you fully understand, you the client case or the situation that you're working through.
Great points. Thanks, Eric. So the second chunk is the data collection and analysis piece. This should take about 11 to 17 minutes. This is really like the big chunk of the case where you're going to demonstrate sound judgment. And the point of this isn't really to test your like simple calculations that the interviewer will give you. Rather, it's to test how you can swiftly make opinions and guide decisions based on the computations that you're making. So we want to see in this piece that you're really demonstrating sound judgment. You're going to have limited information, and the interviewer is going to ask you a few probing questions based on the calculations that you're making and the probing questions that you have. So it's really just to test your capability to apply your business judgment in this piece here. From a personal point of view, what I would say is I've interviewed folks who have made mistakes and who have gone on to get offers. If you make a mistake in this piece, I would say try to get over it and continue. Don't let it drag you down, because there's a lot of times where folks will let it get to them and then the rest of the case is kind of ruined for them. So, and it's disheartening to see because the candidate was doing so well in the beginning. So as you're doing real cases, and if you make a mistake in the case, practice that real life scenario of I just made a computational error, but I'm going to move on. Let's not restart the case. And then the last piece is the recommendations piece. And this again should take you 3 to 5 minutes, similar to the beginning. And this is where you're going to do a lot more of the talking. So you'll have time to synthesize your thoughts and draw conclusions from your analysis at the end of the interview. And then you come forward with, these are my recommendations for the client. And you'll perhaps also throw in, I would consider these risks, or as next steps, they should move forward with ABC. And don't panic if the answer is not quite apparent, because like we said, there's sometimes so many different answers to a case. It may not just be clear, black or white. So really use the hypotheses that you formed in the beginning, and then understanding the data that you analyzed in that middle chunk. Say, okay, I tested hypotheses A, hypotheses B, and hypothesis C, and found that hypothesis A is most likely, and so therefore, I recommend ABC.
I also think a trick, particularly to the recommendations and next steps, is to look back at your original framework and think about what you didn't get to or you didn't answer, but still makes sense based off of where the case went. Oftentimes the interviewer has a path they're trying to guide you on, but that's because they're trying to get to an answer in 25 minutes, not because it's that easy. So think about what things you thought of at first that you just maybe didn't get to, and could potentially sway your answer if you learn something different. So those are, to me, is a good trick to think about. Okay, what else would I think about, or what else would I be concerned with if I had more time?
Great. Okay, so just getting into a little bit more of a visual and what I was referring to in testing your hypotheses. On the right, you'll see what a sort of hypothesis tree looks like on the different conditions that you're going to test. And so, if the cause of some problem is conditions 1, 2, or 3, we start by assuming that most ostensibly the likely condition is 1. And the cause, you look at the cause of that and then check whether or not it's true. And if it's not, then we iterate the same process with the other options, number 2 and number 3. And the hypothesis-driven approach is very much used in the consulting world. This is actually how we solve problems with our clients. So instead of going through a laundry list of things and saying, oh, we could possibly reduce costs using these millions of ways, what we do is we use a hypothesis-driven approach, which is efficient because it allows you to always move forward towards a solution to the main problem and you maintain tight focus, you avoid getting sidetracked onto a million different things, and instead you focus on one issue at hand and you say, is this true, yes or no? And then you move on to the rest of the items, and it should be in priority. If you have an inkling of the priority of the conditions, you should definitely work on the ones that are most important. On here, we walk through a few different examples of frameworks that you can use. So revenue, M&A, cost reduction, strategic sourcing. You'll review these as you go through case prep if you haven't already. These are kind of like the standard frameworks that I was referring to in the beginning. And they're just 4 examples for 4 different types of cases, but there are obviously many others that you'll get familiar with as you go through your case prep. The important thing is to just take a moment when you first get the case, really think about what the problem is, clearly define it, and then come up with like what the framework is. Don't try to just retrofit something that you think is going to work.
Yeah, and like I said earlier, because every interviewer has their own case, it's very unlikely that every one that we come up with is going to fit exactly with one of these 4 frameworks. I know mine definitely doesn't, but it's a good opportunity to test how you think about problems. So they're good to know, and it's good for practice to get it right, but don't be too rigid. Think about what the problem is. Use that Q&A portion of the case to really develop a framework to think through it.
Exactly. And I think it actually shows a lot of like out of the box thinking when people come forward with, an industry specific type of framework, or, they'll tell you point blank that, they're not going to use one of these like standard frameworks, but they're just thinking about like how they would see it. They come up with their own. I think it shows a bit of like creativity in the problem solving space. So really think about the problem. And then last thing is we'll walk through an example issue tree. I won't go through everything, but I will walk through like the first arm of the overarching issue. So in this example, the big question is, how can company X increase sales at least 5% annually by 2025? The main issues break down into how can we increase sales per customer, or how can we increase the number of customers so that you grow the pie? So walking with the first main issue, how can we increase sales per customer? There's 3 hypotheses. One is there's a potential to increase customer demand. The second is clients' purchasing potential can be increased. And then the third is the customer mix can be optimized so that you can increase sales per customer. So going with the first hypothesis, there's a potential to increase customer demand. You then can break it down into 4 questions, which is, can we introduce new products? Is there a potential to improve the success of visits of sales reps so that you drive demand? How can we improve technical service to improve efficiency? And then how can we find new potential for growth, or is there even new potential for growth? So you would go about solving those questions and then move forward. Now, this is pretty involved. You probably won't have time to make this kind of an issue tree. It may only go, you may only have a few arms of a hypothesis and a few questions for each of the hypotheses. But this kind of shows you how we think about problems. So I've had real engagements where we've had to make issue trees like this to think about how to solve a client's problem. And you'll learn it, with the first week of Kearney training. This is in there. So that's it for the case. I hope that was helpful. And I guess we'll open it up now for any questions that you guys have.
Thanks so much, Karen. Okay, so the first question was for the behavioral interview, is it preferred that we give examples and stories from our professional lives?
So I would say what matters most is that the answer fits the question. So that should be your first criteria. Just because it's a good story, if it doesn't answer the question, then you're not really serving the purpose of the question itself. So, but barring that, if you've got multiple stories, professional environments, I would prioritize over others. It doesn't mean that we don't care about your school experiences or anything else. But if I had to have a preference, given two equally good stories, I would lean professional.
Agree. And I think you can always tack on school experiences as an added bonus, but definitely the priority should be professional experience.
Thank you both. So the next question is for the case interview. Does Kearney prefer more conversational style or interviewee-led style?
I think both.
Yeah, I think it's going to depend on the interviewer. As I was saying, every interviewer is different. So you kind of have to feel out the situation a little bit.
Yeah, it should definitely be conversational, though. You should definitely drive towards that. But I do think we tend to do like interviewee led, where we expect the interviewees to drive it.
And is it necessary to show the interviewer the framework?
I would, unless your framework is so simple that it's easy to articulate. Putting it down on paper and using that as a tool to talk through how you're thinking is incredibly valuable. So it might feel awkward holding up a piece of paper in front of a computer or camera, but it's worth at least doing and trying, and I would recommend doing that.
And should you do that just when you're asked to show your work, or periodically, throughout the interview?
I would say periodically, and where you think it makes sense, right? You'll know through conversation as you're going through. Am I asking a one-off question with a short answer response, or am I going to walk through my thinking? Usually it's when you're walking through your thinking that it's most appropriate to be, showing your paper. If you're multiplying a few things on paper, you don't need to hold up your calculations, but, start either answering a question or diving a little bit deeper onto a topic, there's usually a good place to be showing up your thought process.
Yeah, and look, it's tough in the virtual environment. Interviewing, on a screen is definitely not the same especially for the case, because you don't get to just like turn your paper to the side and work alongside the interviewer. So it's tough. But I would say that the more sharing you do, the better it helps you, because we can see your framework, your line of thinking, and then we can say, actually, no, don't go down that rabbit hole. We want to steer you somewhere else. So I think it's only beneficial for you.
Thank you. So regarding chart clearing, is it okay to ask for time to look at the chart before digging in, and how much time is appropriate? Same goes for brainstorming. Can we ask for time, and is it more desirable to be able to just go at it without asking for time?
It's a good question, and I think this is where the virtual environment might change my answer a little bit. I think brainstorming, for sure, it's definitely okay to say, hey, can I have 30 seconds to think about this? When you're building a framework or just thinking through ideas, it's okay to take time. But I will say, knowing your thought process is extremely valuable. It can feel awkward to just be spitballing ideas or multiplying numbers out loud. And it's probably more important in a virtual environment, but even in an in-person environment, that's still the recommended approach, right? Because it allows us to think or to understand your thought process, which, as Karen was saying earlier, is oftentimes more important than getting the right answer. And so I would just try to be as vocal as you can and saying something that might not sound right during a brainstorming session, as long as you acknowledge that through that process. If you say something like, oh, well, maybe that won't work, that's all okay. It still gives us a chance to understand how you think about the problem. But if you are the kind of person who really likes just to take a breather, it's okay to ask for it. I just wouldn't do it for more than 20 seconds because it can get awkward.
Perfect. So we talked a lot about the behavioral and case portions of the assessment, but could you speak more to the interaction experiences portion of the assessment?
Yeah, so not only do we have virtual seminars like this, but we as a firm are pretty open in terms of being willing to talk to candidates who are interested. And so use outreach, alumni, LinkedIn connections, et cetera, to really try and get to know the firm. Because those kinds of things, they make their way through and recruiting knows about them. So it's more than just, writing a good cover letter and sending an impressive resume, right? Like, we want to know that you're interested in the firm, interested in learning about the kind of work that we do and understanding where it intersects with your interests as well. So that part of it I find important as well.
Yeah, it's a good way to test, like, am I walking away from these conversations feeling energized about the potential to work at Kearney? And if so, then, you're going to do better in the interviews themselves. And it also gives you an opportunity to test, like, if you have, passions in specific industries or services, like, ask about the kind of work that we do in those areas and see if, those are the kinds of things that you want to do.
Yep. And is there an ideal length for behavioral answers?
So we don't use stopwatches, so it's hard to say exactly. And again, different interviewers will have different styles. So your typical like 3 to 4 minute answer might work, but you might get probed on the same answer over and over again. That doesn't mean, if you spent the whole interview on one story, that's not a bad sign, right? So, there's always kind of that intro answer using the SAO approach. It will refine and sort of limit the way you answer questions. But it might be interesting. You might draw the interviewer's interest into that, and they might ask you to learn more. So that's not necessarily a bad thing. I wouldn't be too prescriptive about it.
Yeah, I agree. If the interviewer is interested in hearing more, they'll ask questions and probe further. So just try to have a succinct story with like the real meat of the story in the beginning, and then, the partner will probe wherever the partner wants to probe.
What would your recommendation be for approaching cases where one would not know anything about the industry?
Ask questions early. I mean, the types of questions that or the cases you're going to get aren't, name the 3 biggest players in the aerospace industry, right? Like it's not valuable for the interviewer, and it doesn't make for a good conversation anyway. They're generally concepts, once you sort of understand a few terminology, it's pretty applicable. You don't need to know the ins and outs of every industry, but understanding keywords, use that Q&A portion at the beginning to really make sure you understand the situation, the client, any idiosyncrasies that you might be dealing with. It's a good time to, let that intellectual curiosity shine, and how well you're able to interpret and internalize that bit of the case.
Yeah, I was going to say this happened to me, but I think something that helps is that you can still structure problems a similar way, even if you're not sure of the industry. So try to think about like, whatever it is that you're really familiar with, say it's CPG and you got a case in banking. In the sense that like it's still a B2C type of problem, like it's still a consumer type of problem. Let's say in this case, you can still think about consumer questions that could be applicable in the banking space or financial institution space, even though you don't know anything about banking. You know what I mean? So like try to see if there are ways that like, well, I would think about it this way in the consumer world. And so therefore, maybe some of those things are still applicable in banking.
Mm-hmm. And do behavioral interviews comprise of a series of questions, or is it just one question for the entire 45-minute duration?
I would say it depends on the interviewer, but most instances are going to be multiple questions.
Can we write up the framework on an iPad and share the screen?
So
I don't see why not.
God, Karen?
I was just going to say, I don't see why not.
Yeah. I haven't done it personally or seen anyone do it personally, but I do believe our interview platform has a screen sharing capability. And so if you're able to make it work or have been able to do it, go for it.
And then in the case structure example, is it normal to have so many hypotheses? We were told once that there should only be one in the beginning.
Yeah, the hypothesis tree that we went through has a lot of different branches. So, but it depends on the case. You may have one hypothesis that you're testing. Sometimes it's like 2 or 3. So it's really up to the case. They are so individual and so based on like true experiences that consultants have when they create the case that it's hard to have like one mind fits all kind of approach.
Perfect. And I think we just have 1 minute left. So I would love to just hear one last piece of advice that each of you have for the group. Oh.
So for me, the best piece of advice is to relax and try to bring your own personality into the interview. If you're someone who likes to think out loud and be very communicative and conversational, then don't be afraid of bringing that out. We're not only trying to assess whether you can get the right answer on a case or answer your question in the most SAO way. We want to understand you as a person. Could we work with you? Could I see myself spending 80 hours a week for 8 weeks on a project with you? That's that's kind of what we are looking for as well, and I think something that people don't necessarily think about through their interview process.
Yeah, it's tough because you've prepared so much and you want to make sure that you can calm your nerves and not come off as too robotic. So that's a great point. I think my tip would be try to think outside the box and come up with a creative solution. And test this. Like it's something that you can actually develop as you're going through case prep. As you case prep with other people, like ask, the other person that you're prepping with was my solution to like standard or meh? Like, are there other things that I could think about? And try to really come up with unique solutions.
Great. Thank you, Karen and Derek, so much for being a part of this and answering these questions. And to everybody on the call, best of luck with your interview process. And thanks so much for your interest in Kearney. Have a great afternoon.